So, Colin, you remember Downton Abbey, right?
I've actually never seen Downton Abbey.
Okay.
It's to my great shame.
Well, put it on your to-do list because it's great, and it has everything to do with today's episode. This is post-World War I, and there's massive social and political upheaval. And one particular character that I love is this guy named Tom Branson. Strong name, super hot. He is the driver for the Crawleys, the aristocratic family living at Downton. He falls in love with Lady Sybil Crowley, one of the main family's daughters. And so he becomes intertwined with this family. The awkward thing is he's Irish. Not only that, he's a socialist and a Republican.
And by Republican, you mean an Irish nationalist, not a Ronald Reagan lower taxes guy.
That's right. And Republican in this context means that he's actually in support of an independent Ireland that is free from the British Empire, meaning he wants to establish a Republic of Ireland. And this story plays out pretty much right at the time of the War of Independence, and all this change is happening. And I just love the tension it causes, because you have on one hand Tom Branson, who's very clear about his convictions, and he's not shy about sharing it with the others. And because of his love for Lady Sybil Crowley, the family kind of has to accept him, even though they have major problems with his politics.
I lost a cousin in the Easter Rising last year. He was walking down North King Street one day, and an English soldier saw him and shot him dead. When they asked why he was killed, the officer said, because he was probably a rebel.
The tensions between Branson and the Crawley family are a great metaphor for something that is actually playing out in real time across the Irish Sea in Ireland at this very moment, where there's simmering discontent and conditions are ripe for revolt. Welcome to the future of our former democracy. Today, we're jumping to one of the most pivotal moments in Irish history, their revolutionary period.
Revolutionary periods, I love them.
I love them too. This revolutionary period yields new electoral systems.
Revolutions and electoral systems go together very well to my favorite topics.
For this story, they really need to be discussed together. They're the result of decades, or in this case, centuries of lived experience coming together. We'll see how revolution impacts the upcoming War of Independence, which will impact partition.
And partition is the agreement with the British that draws the jurisdiction we now refer to as Northern Ireland.
Right. Today, we're looking at an extremely volatile 10 years, when an insurrection combined with global forces around the First World War lead to expansion of voting rights and new electoral systems. This is quickly followed by the War of Independence and ultimately partition, the permanent separation of the south of Ireland, what we now call the Republic of Ireland, and the north of Ireland, formerly called Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom.
And the moment partition is enacted, the north and south of Ireland are set on very different paths.
Yes, very different.
So we've talked about four major historical events: the Ulster Plantations, the Cromwellian Conquest, the Battle of the Boyne, and the Great Hunger. These events get to the heart of the tension and conflict and oppression that's been created in Ireland as a colony of England and Great Britain. And that all brings us now to the beginning of the 20th century, where all these conflicts over the last few hundred years come to a head.
World War I upends the social, political, and economic order throughout Europe, particularly Great Britain.
England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. So the idea being...
England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. What a great phrase. And this slogan goes back centuries to 1798. Dara, our tour guide in Dublin, tells us more.
So the idea being England, in the biggest war they'd ever been in now, with all the attention on the continent, wouldn't be able to defeat a rebellion in Ireland. They saw this now as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fight for independence when it could actually be won.
So as Great Britain is fighting with these other major empires, they're spending a lot of money. Frankly, they're distracted.
I think all this goes to show how important global forces are in local politics, and sometimes that context gets lost in time. Before World War I, Britain had the luxury of largely being able to focus almost exclusively on building its empire, especially in Ireland, because they feared civil war. When war broke out, having to fight other European powers suddenly consumed all of their attention.
In April 1916...
So that's during World War I, the Brits are fighting right now in Western Europe.
They have a full plate. Irish nationalists launched an armed revolt against British rule in Ireland, the Easter Rising. This revolt lasted 6 days and led to the execution of many of its leaders.
Unfortunately for the rebels, there's a lot of confusion and bad luck. In the crucial days before the planned insurrection, they're in disarray. A ship from Germany carrying lots of crucial ammunition was scuttled. There was forged letters. Thousands of soldiers were being ordered to fight. No, stand down. No, actually, go fight again.
No one really knows what to believe anymore.
That's Eric Stewart with the General Post Office, or GPO, Museum, the site of the Easter Rising.
With so much confusion, the various rebel leaders had hoped for roughly 4,000 or so troops of the various revolutionary groups to turn out.
Only 1,500 troops show up.
They take the General Post Office, the GPO, on Sackville Street as their headquarters. At about 12:45 p.m. that day, Patrick Pearse reads his proclamation, where he declares an Irish republic to be completely independent from the British government now. Now, they had assumed that because it's Easter weekend, a big holiday weekend, then they believed lots of British troops and officers would be out of town for the weekend. And they were actually correct. There's only 400 combat-ready troops in the city at the time. So for the first couple of days at least, the rebels actually outnumber the British troops about 4-1. But this changes very quickly, however. The following morning, Tuesday morning, martial law is declared, first in the city, then countrywide. So the army are in complete command of the country. And the rebels had not taken any ports or railway stations. So British troops are very easily able to move in and about the city. By Wednesday morning, there's thousands of British troops hastily being redeployed from Britain to here.
So quickly, in fact, many British troops believe they're going to France to fight in the First World War.
When they get here off the boat in what was then Kingstown, now Dunleary, they believe they're in France. They begin greeting all the locals in French. Of course, they quickly realize they are not in France, and they're here to put down some sort of insurrection taking place in Dublin City. By Thursday, the various rebel groups begin to lose communication with each other, and by Friday, General Sir John Maxwell arrives into the town from Britain. He takes command of the situation, and what he says is, right, the GPO, that's their headquarters. Our artillery isn't doing a whole lot to its outer walls, they're too thick, but our incendiary rounds can light the roof on fire. So they begin shelling the building with incendiaries, the building goes on fire, roofs collapsing in itself, and the rebels begin to spill out onto the city streets. As they're making their way through the city, they come face to face with the hundreds of civilian casualties, those who they're fighting for and who are dying as a result of the rebellion. So they begin to realize they're doing more harm than good, and so they choose to surrender on the Saturday. And because they'd lost communication with each other, it takes about a day or so for them all to realize that it's over. By Sunday afternoon, the Easter Rising has completely come to an end.
It was a big miscalculation by the rebels. They thought they could poke the eye of the British while they were distracted, such that the British would cry uncle. And that's not what happened.
So it's 1916, the British are still fighting World War I, and they've just put down this surprise rebellion in Dublin. Now they decide they have to make an example of the rebel leaders.
As far as the law was concerned, they had committed rebellion in wartime. Still part of the British Empire, it was the highest form of treason they could possibly commit. So, a military firing squad would be their punishment.
In total, 16 rebel leaders are executed. Now, it's interesting that initially, during the rebellion, more than half of those killed are civilians, no part in the fighting, and the entire city centre is more or less rubble. So, there is some support for the rebels amongst the working classes, but by and large, the public are very much against the death and destruction they have seemingly caused. But this changes very, very quickly. The executions, for example, are seen as inhumane, unjust, an example of imperial aggression, unjust British rule in Ireland.
James Connolly's execution was particularly barbaric. He was a leading socialist and very popular amongst the working classes, and he had been wounded during the Easter Rising, to the point where he had to be tied to an armchair for his execution.
He was so badly injured that he couldn't walk, he couldn't even stand. Had they left him in his sickbed, he would have died anyway. But they wanted to make an example of him. He was too badly injured to stand to face a firing squad. So he was tied to a stretcher, carried out and strapped to a chair, semi-conscious, to face the firing squad. The
image of that in the minds of the Irish public was very controversial. So the executions actually turned almost overnight the Irish public in favour of the rebels and sympathy.
While the Irish Republicans make a military miscalculation, Thinking they could win a war they weren't really prepared for, the British make a political miscalculation. Plenty of Irish people actually opposed the Easter Rising and didn't favor the revolution. But after the brutal public executions, those folks changed their minds. The British overplayed their hand. This movement towards an independent Ireland gained momentum. This momentum led to serious talks of splitting Ireland into North and South. As famed poet W.B. Yeats wrote in his poem Easter 1916, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. The Republican movement gained more and more momentum in the wake of the Easter Rising. And in the winter of 1918, during the first election since World War I started, change was afoot.
This is a very historic general election, not just in Ireland, in Britain as well. It was the first general election since 1911, because the war had been going on. It wasn't some tyrant saying no democracy or whatever. The war was going on, so they put off the elections. The war was finished now. And because of the sacrifices in the war, they had to make people who were involved in the war effort seem like it was worth it, that they'd achieved something. So previously, before 1918, only men of property could vote. So the governments produced would obviously reflect that it was men of property who were voting. Now, all men 21 and up could vote, regardless of how little property, if any, you had. And women over 30 could vote. So there was still a sexist element. They were terrified of the radicalism of young women, so they didn't want them voting.
Wow, you really can't make this stuff up?
No, no, you can't. But still, more people than ever could vote in Ireland. The franchise expanded from just about 300,000 people in 1911 to over 3 million people in 1918.
So it was way more representative of what the people actually wanted, And in this general election, Sinn Féin, the radical Republican Party, on all their posters, it said a vote for us is a vote for an Irish Republic. They weren't trying to hide what they stood for, very vocal in what they stood for. They won 73 seats out of a possible 105.
Sinn Féin actually only wins about 47% of the vote. But because Westminster elections are under a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post electoral system, the results are skewed heavily in favor of Sinn Féin.
This was a clear mandate for an Irish Republic that had been declared in Easter of 1916. Now, of those 73 Sinn Féin politicians who had been elected, only 27 of them made it to the first meeting of the Parliament, because the rest of them were either in prison or on the run. So as I say, it was very much a revolutionary Parliament when they met.
And when they met in early 1919, they declared Ireland independent again, calling on all free nations to recognize their autonomy.
The Republicans in the Parliament quite naively, but seems to have been genuinely, but quite naively believed Ireland's just going to be given a republic now. We voted for it, so we're going to get it.
And context, as ever, is important here. Ireland is declaring independence in the wake of World War I.
So the Treaty of Versailles, these negotiations were going on. The President of America, Woodrow Wilson, was talking about, his 14 points, how they're going to change the world to make democracy safe. And he was talking about the self-determination of nations. That's how the world's going to be structured. An end to the old imperial order. Now everybody's going to get self-determination kind of thing. The Republicans were like, oh, happy days, They didn't read the small print. It was the self-determination of nations within the losing powers, right? So all the losing empires were broken up. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, they were all broken up and new states were founded across Europe. So that's why they believed we're going to get a republic. It looks like it's going to happen. The British Empire, the French Empire expanded in this period, got bigger than ever, both of them did. So it didn't actually happen, as I say.
Amidst this surge of enthusiasm for an independent Republic of Ireland in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, and remember, we still have those changes to the voting franchise at the end of World War I, 1918 becomes an historic election year in Ireland.
In 1918, the system of voting was the same as Britain. It was first past the post. There's a lot of problems with first past the post. It's not exactly representative of, it's a winner takes all kind of thing, so it's not exactly representative. So actually, I say Sinn Féin swept the board 73 seats out of a possible 105, but they benefited from first past the post. They didn't get, if there was single transferable vote, the results would have been a bit lower than that. So the British government brought in single transferable vote in 1920 in Ireland for the local elections to try and undermine Sinn Féin support.
I'll pause here to call out that phrase, single transferable vote. That's the proportional representation method that they use in Ireland and that used to be used more widely in the United States. Basically, it's a form of ranked choice voting. So instead of just voting for one candidate that you like, you get to say who your first choice is, and if they can't win, who your second choice is. And then the other trick is instead of just electing one person to represent everyone, you elect a bunch of people with the idea that, every 1/5 of the electorate can elect one of 5 councillors or one of 5 members of parliament. That's a simplification, but enough to get you through the day.
And surprisingly, even though Sinn Féin won an overwhelming majority in 1918 under first-past-the-post, winner-take-all, they actually were advocating for a change to the electoral system to proportional representation.
So Britain actually changed the voting system in 1920 from first-past-the-post, winner-take-all, to a system of proportional representation in direct response to Sinn Féin doing so well back in that 1918 election. Because under a proportional system, Sinn Féin only would have won about half the seats. So they're trying to impose this system in a cynical effort to undermine support for Sinn Féin. That would make Sinn Féin win a little bit fewer seats. And yet Sinn Féin was actually okay with that.
Exactly. They wanted the electorate to be represented more democratically.
I feel like you almost never see elected officials or political parties willing to give more representation to their minority, especially in the US, like with gerrymandering. The goal is always to give your opposition as few seats as possible, even if it's artificially inflating your own power.
It's pretty cool. I mean, they were just very true to their core beliefs.
I feel like we don't see that very often in America.
You're so cynical.
They swept the boards in 1920 anyway with this new system. And also, the Labour Party did way better than it had. It didn't even stand in the general election in 1918 because they didn't want to take away from Sinn Féin's vote, but they did in the local elections, and they were the second biggest party. So it actually benefited the revolutionary movement, even though it was trying to undermine it.
So you now have a mass democratic outworking of Irish republicanism, which Irish Republicans take as being their right to set up what's called the first Dáil, their own independent parliament, which Britain, the British government, say is not legitimate.
Our friend, Dominic Bryan from Queen's University Belfast, makes such an important point here. This election is not only a watershed moment at the time that establishes the legitimacy of the long-term vitality of the Republican movement throughout the 20th century. In many ways, it's this Rorschach test. What is this election about? The British saw it as the first election to Westminster after World War I, in which the Irish elected a bunch of rebels who deserved to be in prison and not serve in the British House of Commons. To the Irish nationalists, they saw this as a first election for new leaders who carried their hopes and dreams of an independent Ireland.
In fact, a lot of those leaders were already in prison because they were some of the leaders of the Easter Rising. And that's why this moment ends up casting such a long shadow. The Sinn Féin party today, that's still active, can trace their origin all the way back to this moment, to this election, when Irish nationalists elected their rebel leaders, hoping to build a new country. That's where a lot of their claims to political legitimacy, especially in the North, comes from.
Right. In many ways, all roads lead back to this 1918 election.
So it's a very important election because violent resistance by Republicans from that point on is based on the legitimacy that was denied by the British state of that 1918 election.
Imposing proportional representation was, ironically, employed as a cynical tool to undercut people the British wanted to keep out of power.
And now we're back to that central question. What is the purpose of elections? And in this case, in this Rorschach test, the Brits see the purpose of elections as the method by which to give themselves as much power as possible and to decrease power for their opposition. And Sinn Féin, in this case, saw the purpose of elections as trying to accurately reflect the public in their elections. And that's why both sides supported this transition of electoral systems from winner-take-all to proportional representation. But the Brits wanted it because it would make their political opponents weaker, and Sinn Féin wanted it because they thought even though it would make them weaker, it would make the democracy stronger.
One last point about this was just for the island of Ireland. The British still kept first past the post for their own elections because, in that situation, they still benefited from it. It's the rules for thee and not for me.
Right. I think it sort of really underscores that the Brits have a very different analysis of what the purpose of elections are than their subjects.
What happens next is a 2.5-year-long guerrilla war known as the War of Independence.
That same day, by coincidence of history, but it's very convenient for Irish historians because it happened on the same day, but the same day that the Parliament met and declared Ireland to be independent again, down the countryside in a place called Tipperary, a couple of Irish Republicans had an ambush on policemen who were transferring explosives from one area to another, gelignite, and they shot dead 2 policemen. So this is seen as the start of the War of Independence, because these were the first bullets fired the same day, as I say, the Parliament met and declared Ireland to be independent. Now, initially, as I say, the war that was going on the ground, so these Republicans who shot these policemen were not following anybody's orders. They took the initiative themselves to do this, and the Parliament actually initially discredited. They didn't agree with what they said.
But the Irish Parliament's disavowal of violent resistance wouldn't last long. In response to not being granted independence, Republicans began to authorize targeted attacks on the British Army by forming a new organization dedicated to resisting British rule, the Irish Republican Army, or IRA.
And as I say, this was a guerrilla war, the War of Independence. So it was characterized by ambushes, tactical assassinations, burning things down, boycotting British rule, mass civil resistance, all this kind of stuff. And it was very much a mass movement. The military aspect always gets all the attention, right? Because it gets the blood pumping, gets the adrenaline going. It's very exciting and all the rest. It's easy to dramatize. But the IRA at the time had over 100,000 members in them. And the vast, vast majority of them, like over 95% of them, never would have held a gun. So literally like knocking on doors and leafleting and all the rest, but also organising demonstrations and protests, enforcing boycotts, digging up roads to prevent the British troops moving around Ireland. But they prosecuted the guerrilla war very successfully. So they brought the British Army, or the British government rather, to the negotiation table. There was a truce declared in July of 1921, which ultimately resulted in a treaty.
I come back to Yeats's phrase, terrible beauty, because it articulates a really important tension of this revolutionary period. On the one hand, most Irish nationalists viewed an independent Ireland as being a great thing, and yet that independence came at a really high price.
With the commencement of the War of Independence and the revitalization of the revolutionary movement, there's a bit of a split in that movement. On the one hand, you have the hardline, more militant Republicans who are willing to fight and die for a complete republic, unified the entire country. But you have another side, which is more pragmatic, more realistic, perhaps you might even say, who will compromise with the British government as long as they get more and more freedoms for the country in some sort of peace settlement.
Over the next 2 years, this violent sectarian conflict played out gradually. The British lost more and more authority in the south and west, eventually reaching a stalemate, and finally, a very fraught compromise, the Anglo-Irish Treaty.
The most infamous, long-lasting provision of what would become the Anglo-Irish Treaty is the partition of the country into the north and south. The Unionist-dominated areas in Ulster, they had already been promised, well before this negotiation took place, a form of home rule, essentially. In 1920, the Government of Ireland Act made this legal and put into effect. And even in the months before these negotiations for a treaty took place, in October of 1921, in July that year, the elections had been held for this new Parliament in Northern Ireland. So it was already underway and taking shape in practice.
And George, I think it's worth pausing here just to remind folks that Unionists refer to those who supported union with Great Britain and are often also identified as being Protestant, and are usually considered ethnically English and Scottish. You'll also often hear them called Ulster Unionists. You'll recall the Ulster Plantations, which is a major political party that arising out of this era, the Ulster Unionist Party. All of these terms signal a person is loyal to the crown. The English and Scottish settler colonialism was so successful that at this point, Belfast is 75% Protestant. These are the folks who are mostly called Unionists. And on the other side, we have the Republicans, the Nationalists, those who disproportionately tend to be Catholic and ethnically Irish, and their major party, focused primarily on reunification with the south of Ireland, is Sinn Féin, meaning we ourselves. So in extremely simplified terms, Sinn Féin, Irish nationalists, Catholics are one group of people, and the Ulster Unionists and Protestants are another. And these distinctions are mostly relevant to the north in what will become Northern Ireland, and much less so in the south in what will become the Republic of Ireland.
Spot on. I'm glad we did that. What comes next is an attempt by Unionists to draw up a border which would maximize their power in the long term.
But how do you divide a country that's never been divided before, you know? Like, it's easy. We've 100 years now of partition. So it's easy to look at the map and say, that's Northern Ireland, that's the rest of Ireland, you know, it's just a normal kind of thing or whatever. But this was drawn on a map, you know, and how do you decide how to partition a place? The way that was agreed was that there would be a boundary commission. So an independent body containing nationalist representatives, unionist representatives, and then independent lawyers from around the world would go around Ulster, which was the northern province, which was the contested area, and see what the population wants. You can disagree with partition totally and very fairly, but once it was accepted, that's a nice way to do it. That's a democratic way to do it. See what the population wants and design the border that way, right? Had that have been done, the counties of Antrim and Down, which is where Belfast is, they always had a majority unionist population. So they were always going to be partitioned once partition was going to happen. The county of Derry, half of Derry and half of Armagh also had majority unionist population. So again, once partition was accepted, they were always going to be part of a Northern Irish state. But the other half of Derry, which includes Derry City, the other half of Armagh, which includes Newry, and then the other counties in Ulster, Donegal, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Monaghan, Cavan, all had majority nationalist population. So again, if they followed through, listened to what the population want, they would be part of a nationalist state. The British government did the maths and they realised, right, if we actually follow through with this, Northern Ireland will have about 3 counties or 3.5 counties. That was seen as wouldn't be viable economically. So they didn't do it in this way. They didn't listen to what the population actually wanted. So as I say, it would be unviable economically. So instead, Northern Ireland was given 6 counties: Fermanagh, Antrim, Tyrone, Derry, Armagh and Down. That was the most land it could get on a county-wide basis that would have a unionist majority. But it immediately meant the nationalist population of the state were completely alienated from the state. They had been promised, you're going to be looked after in this boundary commission. You're going to be given to the nationalist state. And the rug was swept from under their feet. And the state was born in violence. Between 1920 and 1922, over 500 people were killed in Belfast alone in sectarian violence. Both communities suffered enormously. And the dead were about 65% Catholic, about 35% Protestant. So both communities suffered in this. But the population of Belfast at the time was about 75% Protestant, about 25% Catholic. So Catholics were almost 3 times represented in the dead. So they were clearly targeted in this violence.
The jurisdiction that is today called Northern Ireland is really just 2/3 of the Ulster Plantation, where the English were most successful at changing the population demographics over the last few centuries of settler colonialism. The signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty leads to violence in the north, but also surprisingly in the south, where the new Free State of Ireland descends into 1 year of civil war between the more militant anti-treaty forces and the pro-treaty side. Between 1922 and 1923, over 1,000 people died, and it ended in a truce. But the enduring legacy of the War of Independence is complicated. It led to the partition of the North and the Civil War in the Southern Free State, leaving a bitter legacy still felt today.
The Rising is really seen as the birth of our republic, even though it was defeated. You know, it's way easier to commemorate a glorious defeat than a problematic victory. And the War of Independence, which established the southern state here, ended with a civil war and partition. So it's very difficult to celebrate and commemorate. Whereas the Rising was this glorious defeat. So it's way more central to kind of celebrating republicanism in Ireland.
There are so many different stories and side paths that I kind of want to go down as we're talking about the Easter Rising and the War of Independence. There was a ceasefire that happened every day at St. Stephen's Green so that someone could feed the ducks. The whole fact of the Irish getting aid from Germany because during World War I, the Germans thought the enemy of the enemy is my friend. There's the story of the rebel Joseph Mary Plunkett, who got engaged and married and then was executed all on the same day. He and his wife had 10 minutes together after they were married before he was executed, where they just held hands. Michael Collins hatched a plot to kidnap Woodrow Wilson to try to get him to pay attention to the plight of Irish independence. It's all just so cinematic.
It is. Alas, if we only had more time, there is so much fodder for a podcast exploring any one of these events. but I want to get to the electoral dynamics that emerge out of this period, because this is where the North and the South split.
Right. Because we've talked a lot about the ways that Ireland's North and South had very divergent experiences, but now, with partition, we're seeing how their paths actually formally and officially diverge in more of a mechanical sense.
Very much so. We know that there have been cultural and political identity shifts, but this is a period where the north of Ireland formally becomes a separate jurisdiction. Before this time, we have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Great Britain had basically subsumed all of Ireland because they wanted to control it. And then after this time of partition, Northern Ireland continues to be in a union with the United Kingdom. And so the name change seems very small, but it's actually a big deal. It used to be the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which is all of that island, and Ireland. And after partition,
the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
That's right.
There's the Irish Free State in the south and Northern Ireland in the north,
which stays in union with the United Kingdom.
And that process of separating the North into its own jurisdiction, that's what partition was. I think maybe it's worth pointing out the way we talk about this is inherently political. Like, it might not sound it to, a random American listening, but referring to it as the North of Ireland or Northern Ireland is inherently a political statement.
You'll notice that so far neither Dom nor I have said, we've just said Belfast because we can all agree on that.
I was struck by what poet, theologian, and conflict mediator Padraig Ó Tuama said when we spoke with him in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland.
I'm an Irish nationalist as far as we're concerned. You're still in Ireland. You were in Ireland this morning. Of course, we're in a different jurisdiction, but other people would very clearly, and they have the right to say, well, you're in the UK now. That's not something I would ever say, and I shudder when I hear it. But we live in a place where there is absolutely no consensus about what country we technically are in.
If you say it's a nation or a country or a jurisdiction, you're expressing a political opinion in that very language that you use.
If you put yourself in the shoes of the British, they see themselves as a union of different nations, of Scotland, England, Wales, and so Northern Ireland is just another jurisdiction or nation that is part of this union, which is already kind of like a coalition. All this to say, we, for the purposes of this podcast, will use the term Northern Ireland. It is what is internationally recognized, but it still is fraught. So please accept our shorthand of Northern Ireland, knowing that it has a little asterisk with a fairly long explanation about where that name came from and why it is still contested.
So we've covered a lot, and maybe it's just me, but this revolutionary period has so many different events and movements and moments that seem like they could be easily conflated. So let's review the political and social dynamics. First, in 1916, there's a failed insurrection attempt by a number of Irish Republicans against the British called the Easter Rising.
But that attempt failed, and the British came down too hard on the Irish Republicans, which swung political sentiment. And then after World War I, there's a pivotal election in 1918 when Sinn Féin, the political wing of the Irish Republicans, wins in a landslide, and they declare independence from Britain.
But Britain doesn't grant them independence, so they fight another war, the War of Independence. The War of Independence ends in 1921 with the Partition of Northern Ireland. And partition, in a way, was basically a divorce. It was a legal separation of the Free State of Ireland from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, though, got to keep custody of Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, and there were terms. There was agreements that both sides came to, as you do in any legal separation. And one of those terms led to the Free State of Ireland using proportional representation immediately, which the British mandated essentially as part of their legal terms of separation. The British said, we'll agree to let you become free if you do two things. One, you let us keep the north of Ireland as part of the UK, and two, you have to use proportional representation in your elections. Obviously, there was also a lot more legalese and way more to it, but those are our two takeaways for the purposes of this story.
The Free State of Ireland, which will eventually become the Republic of Ireland, begins using proportional representation immediately and uses it continuously up through the present day. But that's not the story we're telling.
Wait, you mean we're not telling the story of over a century of low-drama, functional, and fair elections down in Dublin and the Republic of Ireland?
Maybe we should? No. We're following the North from here on out. And at this time, the North also adopts proportional representation. The terms of the deal Westminster brokered with the Irish, which established both the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland, said that Northern Ireland would also use proportional representation in the form of single transferable vote, PR-STV, for at least 2 elections.
But the use of proportional representation in the North was very brief, because the newly minted Northern Ireland Parliament would switch back to winner-take-all elections at the first opportunity, because the Loyalist majority realized that that was the best way to maintain their long-lasting hegemony.
The Unionist Party almost immediately got rid of it and returned to a first-past-the-post system, thus giving them the ability in constituencies to control almost all the seats. In fact, as is known, they gerrymandered seats to make sure that they could control almost all the seats, no matter which other alternative politics came along. As we know with first past the post, it can produce some absolute clear results in places, which is why some people love it, in places where there is much less clarity. And that, of course, becomes one of the weaknesses of the first past the post, is that it doesn't take into account a wide diversity of politics that exists. And in a hugely divided society as Ireland was at the time, it's a system which can really enforce a force of majority rule on a minority. And that has real consequences when the northern state of Northern Ireland is set up and very quickly also uses first past the post. So it is really interesting that the British government itself understood when Northern Ireland was set up that the electoral system you choose will make a difference.
And this hegemony plays out in so many different ways. It's not just about the changing of the electoral system. There are so many other details with regard to political participation and democracy in Northern Ireland that are, frankly, manipulated. When we next return to Northern Ireland, we'll follow the seeds of partition through the next 50 years of one-party domination. We'll look at the legal mechanisms through which Unionists, despite being the numerical minority in areas like Derry, Londonderry, for example, were able to maintain tight control. This suppression of Catholics and Irish Republicans takes us to the Civil Rights Movement, and then, because all these dynamics play off one another, to the Troubles.
Oh, wait a minute, George. One last thing. I couldn't help but notice that you just said Derry, Londonderry. And when we were in Northern Ireland, I saw a road sign that also actually said Derry/Londonderry. And we've discussed the show Derry Girls, not Londonderry Girls. So why are people saying Derry, Londonderry?
Right, because if you say Derry, it's essentially saying that you affiliate with Irish nationalists, those who want to reunify with the Republic of Ireland, those that don't believe that they were ever part of Britain. And, on the other hand, if you say Londonderry, you are affiliating with Unionists, aka those that are loyal to the Crown and support the union with Great Britain.
So this goes back to what we were just talking about, how in the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, the different terms we use for things has a lot of heavy, real implications for your political views, for your social life, for your values.
Right. If you think we are obsessed with language in the US, go to Northern Ireland.
I don't know if you have noticed, but I almost unconsciously, but it is very much consciously, I've been saying often the North instead of Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is the name of the state, right? But Republican, generally, I wouldn't even say just Republicans. A lot of people in the South wouldn't really call it Northern Ireland. They would call it the North or the 6 counties, because there's 6 counties in the North. Because, like, as I say, the idea being, if you dig down, as I say, a lot of people, I've been saying it almost unconsciously there, because I do say that all the time. But if you dig down, it's because this was, as I say, imposed on Ireland as a kind of colonial state. So to kind of delegitimize the state, say the North or the 6 counties. It's interesting as well. So up the North, Unionists would very much say Northern Ireland, but they often also say Ulster and, protect Ulster and all the rest. Because Unionists under the Boundary Commission wanted all of Ulster. They didn't just want the 6 counties. So they say Ulster, even though there are counties in Ulster, not in Northern Ireland. They would call it just Ulster, and they often call themselves Ulstermen instead of like Irishmen or something like that. So, you know, what's in a name? There's so much in all these kind of names that you don't even think about sometimes. Even like the War of Independence, right? I've been calling it the War of Independence just for ease. But loads of people would not call it the War of Independence. It's just what is more broadly known. But even Republicans wouldn't really call it the War of Independence because they would say we didn't get independence. You know, it didn't end in independence. So they often call it the Tan War. This is referring to the Black and Tans. These were a paramilitary organisation established by a guy called Hamer Greenwood and Winston Churchill explicitly to cause terror in Ireland amongst the civilian population. They were named after their uniform. They wore a mix of like police leather and khaki brown army uniform, so it's the Black and Tans. And they committed a lot of atrocities here. So I say they're called the Black and Tans after their uniform, and Republicans often call the War of Independence the Tan War, referencing the Black and Tans. Unionists also obviously don't want independence. They wouldn't call it the War of Independence. They call it the Anglo-Irish War. But more broadly, it's just known as the War of Independence. But anyway, as I say, what's in the name? You can say all this stuff very innocuously, but it has kind of a politicized meaning, still very much today.
The power to name something is a profound power, and who gets to name what is always an indication of power. I think in the context of this, that the poets who wrote what we now can call the first chapter of the first book of the Hebrew Bible understood something about power and naming, because the first thing that they gave to the God of that text is the power to name. And so from that point of view, it isn't just a piece of poetry or a piece of theology. It's also a piece of psychology to know that the power to name and the presence of language on the tongue is always an indicating feature of power.
Padraig actually wrote a poem called The Northern of Ireland about this, which he said is designed to irritate everybody.
It is both a dignity and a difficulty to live between these names, perceiving politics in the syntax of the state. And at the end of the day, the reality is that whether we change or whether we stay the same, these questions will remain. Who are we to be with one another? And how are we to be with one another? And what to do with all those memories of all those funerals? And what about those present whose past was blasted far beyond their future? I wake, you wake, she wakes, he wakes, they wake, we wake, and take this troubled beauty forward.
What's in a name? This question really is resonating with me as we tape this. We're seeing unprecedented tests of our democratic system in the US, especially with notable upticks in political violence. There's a lot of conversations or fierce arguments, might be more accurate, on the left around this power to name. And I think it's really prescient, George, that you chose to turn our attention in the United States to Northern Ireland, where to this day there's still tension around even the legally officially recognized names of places like Derry, Londonderry, or the north of Ireland and Northern Ireland. As is pretty obvious at this point, political history, dialogue, and even current events are messy on the island of Ireland, just like how things can be messy here in the United States. So as we go through this story of the Troubles and learn about how that period of horrible violence gets resolved, I personally feel that we can all take something out of that even when we have divisions this long-lasting that are rooted in hundreds of years of generational trauma and violence and colonialism, with recent conflict and strong feelings over words, that all of this can still be navigated to a peaceable and more democratic place, even here in the United States. Because if after all this, the Irish can figure things out, surely we can too. This podcast was produced by Large Media. That's L-A-R-J Media. Maria Paleologos is our producer, editor, and showrunner. Creative direction by Tina Knoll. Sean Simmons, Chris Young, and Sid Gladio are our sound engineers. Editorial and production assistance by Faith Embody and Joelle Knoll. Special thanks to Duji Taha and Isaac Organista. For more information on our electoral systems work, please visit us at www.equitabledemocracy.org. I know you've heard this one a million times before, but if you could like us, rate us, subscribe to us, or even give us a review on Apple Podcasts, it all really does help the show. We'd appreciate it.
I don't actually know what's in a black and tan, but it is. I know it's a shot. I think.
Harping Guinness.
Oh, is it Harping Guinness? Oh, okay. Right. What's an Irish carbon? Because again, you don't get them here.
It's half Guinness and then it's baby coffee.
Oh, right. We have do you ever have a baby Guinness? That's lovely. That's the nicest shot I think is a baby Guinness. It tastes like a dessert. It's so tasty. It's like Bailey's with Kahlua. Bailey's and Kahlua. It's lovely. It doesn't taste like a shot. You could drink a milkshake of it. It's so tasty. So I definitely recommend it if you want.